Today is the 15th Sunday of Ordinary Time. Our Gospel is taken from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 13, verses 1 through 10. Now, in that particular chapter of Matthew's Gospel, there are 7 parables. Indeed, in today's reading, Matthew says Jesus always taught in parables. One scripture scholar, C.H. Dodd, writes, "The parables are perhaps the most characteristic element of Jesus' teaching as recorded in the Gospels. It's therefore crucial that we understand what a parable is, indeed what a parable is not. One of the major confusions is to treat a parable as if it was an allegory and to interpret it allegorically. What's that all about? The allegory is a story where there is a direct reference, a clear reference generally, between the people, events, and things mentioned in the allegory and the people, events, and things experienced by the listeners. Connections can more or less be made. It's a matter of decoding the allegory. Very often, sadly, Jesus' parables have been treated as if they were allegories. I'll give you an example. St. Augustine, of all people, reads the parable of the Good Samaritan as if it was an allegory. Listen to his allegorical interpretation. And I want you to think carefully about the implications of this allegorical interpretation of one of the most loved and best known parables. St. Augustine says, "A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho." That's a quote from the parable. St. Augustine then says, Adam himself is meant. Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the heavenly city of peace from whose blessedness Adam fell. Jericho. Jericho means the moon and signifies our mortality because the moon is born, waxes, wanes, and dies. Thieves. Thieves are the devil and his angels, etc. Now, an allegorical interpretation of an allegory is quite legitimate. But an allegorical interpretation of a parable actually preempts the meaning of the parable, or at least obfuscates it. A parable is something quite different. The parable invites us into a journey of discovery. Again, quoting from C.H. Dodd, "Parables are the natural expression of the mind that sees truth in concrete pictures rather than conceives it in abstractions. At its simplest, the parable is a metaphor or a simile drawn from nature or common life, arresting the hearer by its vividness or strangeness, and leaving the mind in sufficient doubt of its precise application in order to tease it into active thought." There's a crucial distinction here between the allegory and the parable. The parable invites an encounter, a conversation, so that you, the listener, become part of the meaning. The allegory gives you the meaning through a decoding process. The parable doesn't do that. The parable says the meaning awaits you when you engage it, when you listen, when you allow yourself to be teased into active thought. You are part of the parable, of the communication of meaning here. Interpreting the parable is therefore not a matter of decoding. It is rather a matter of letting it awaken and mobilize our imaginations. As such, it will leave the mind in sufficient doubt of its precise application to tease it into active thinking. This is a crucial element in the life of the parable. In effect, it means that each time I listen to the parable, it can have a teasing effect, but an entirely original outcome. I change, I grow. When I last heard this parable, things were on my mind. I was in a certain place, perceiving the world in a certain way, and I participated in that context. Now I participate in a new context, hopefully with a more open mind, a deeper sensitivity. I'm drawn by the imagination into the vividness and strangeness of this open-ended story. So the command is listen. Pay attention. Discover the unique and original meaning that will emerge and can only emerge when you as an individual encounter the parable. Engage in your imaginations with this vivid and strange story. There is an issue here that arises with Matthew's gospel because Matthew himself actually interprets Jesus' parable here as if it was an allegory. I think that is, if you like, fairly reasonably or easily explained, in the sense that the parable does belong to Jesus. He gave the disciples the parable to work with. They came up with their allegorical interpretation, and that sits side by side in the gospel with Matthew's rendition of the parable. However, we shouldn't be distracted by that. We shouldn't think that is the way to interpret the parable. So take the parable, read it gently, thoughtfully, receptively. A sower went out to sow the seed. Listen with the ear of the heart. Read it with your imagination. Allow yourself to become part of the parable. Are you an onlooker? Are you the father or the mother of the sower? Are you the wife, the child, the friend of the sower? What's happening here? What's the plot? Pay attention, listen, become part of the parable. Be drawn into this conversation with the Lord himself.